Hi, this is part 3 of a discussion of how the history of the 20th century in Buddhism has shaped the situation we're in now at the start of the 21st century. If I were going to summarize the subject being discussed in one sentence up to this point, it would be that the crisis of modernity is a crisis of confronting what's ancient and what's not. In the first 2 parts, obviously the big preoccupation was in delving into the political conditions in the 20th century that have shaped the situation we're in now in the 21st. And obviously, the emphasis I've given to it should give you the sense that those political and social conditions and economic conditions have been so overwhelming that they have been more important than the philosophical problem we're talking about now. But by the same token, as the emergency period of what I've termed refugee Buddhism, as that period of emergency has come to an end, as the period of communist persecution has come to an end, and other unique post-war features of the 20th century have petered out, along with certain philosophical movements that were closely linked. Now that profound underlying problem comes to the fore. How far do the implications go of this conflict between what's ancient and what's only apparently ancient? What we now know in the modern age brings into question all of the assumptions that millions of Buddhists learned from their grandparents and regarded as legitimate, authentic, and definitive Buddhism. The other necessary preface to this discussion is what I covered in my very first YouTube video, where I clarify that when I say something is more ancient, I am not claiming that it's more rational or more scientific. Different philosophies from different periods of time are simply different. And nobody should make the claim that, for example, pre-Socratic philosophy, the most ancient philosophy from Greece, is more rational and more scientific than post-Socratic philosophy, simply because it is more ancient. Obviously, when you look at specific thinkers on a case-by-case basis, of course, some are more rational, some are more irrational, some are more spiritual, etc. Any contrast can be made between specific philosophical authors. But what I covered in my first YouTube video was to clarify that when I say something is older, I am not making any kind of claim that it therefore represents a more skeptical, more rational, more scientific attitude within the history of Buddhism. However, if you can transplant yourself into the mindset of a Catholic for a second, you can consider how unsettling it is for modern Catholics to know that in the Bible as we still have it today, the text in this case hasn't changed. In the Bible, the so-called Virgin Mary never was a virgin. It has been a known fact since something like the 2nd century AD that Christians were intentionally mistranslating and promoting a mistranslation of the Hebrew, the Aramaic, etc., that made a word that simply meant young woman appear to mean virgin, and constructed and promoted the miracle of a virgin birth, connecting Jesus to some of the Old Testament prophecies, as I recall, Isaiah. Today, every Christian is confronted with the fact that the more ancient version of the life of Jesus does not include any virgin birth. If your grandparents had raised you to believe that this was central to Catholicism, you can imagine what a strange and unsettling thing it would be to simply know that no, that's not ancient and it's not legitimate. And in a world where everything is unreal, it's not real. Some things are more unreal than others. So the knowledge that ancient Christians who wrote the Bible never even made a claim, never advanced a myth that Jesus was a virgin birth, that must affect the way you regard the religion in some sense. Even though I'm not at all putting forward a claim that the most ancient part of the Bible is more rational. To say that something is coherent is very different from saying that it's rational or even that it's true. The most ancient period of Buddhist philosophy is coherent. It presents its own view of the world. And that view of the world is magical. It is supernatural. It includes gods and demons and a magical mountain at the middle of the world and reincarnation and magical formulas that you can chant to try to protect yourself against venomous snakes. It's a magical, ancient view of what the world is and of our place in it, quite apart from the place of the Buddhist philosophy, which is also very much magical. However, it is coherent. And when you compare that to something that arose many centuries later in Thailand, in Japan, or in China, in a totally different language and totally different culture, it is naturally impossible to make those into one coherent whole, especially in philosophy, but even at the level of ritual. I'm sure there are millions of Christians who continue to celebrate holidays, including Christmas, with the virgin birth included, but also having the knowledge that this is just a later myth added on Christianity, and it's not part of the original biblical tradition, and it's not even something that Jesus wanted people to say about him. He didn't go around preaching, "Hey, you should know I was born from a virgin." Interesting to know what kind of results you get trying to sell that story. So we have thousands of examples in Buddhism where we can likewise say the crisis of modernity makes us confront what's ancient and what's not. And again, what's not ancient, I'm not at all here to tell you that it's what's not ancient can never be a coherent part of the philosophy of the Buddha. It never can be. Japan has a tradition that's still popular today of worshiping the earth womb bodhisattva. I'll put up the Chinese characters here at the top of the screen. This is one of the most popular statue-making, statue-worshipping traditions in Japan. And when Japan occupied and ruled Taiwan, they actually tried to export this tradition to Taiwan. That wasn't so many decades ago. Today, I think that's unthinkable. I don't think there would be any Japanese missionary organization trying to get other cultures and other countries to worship statues of the so-called earth womb bodhisattva. That tradition, people do ascribe miracles and supernatural powers to it, less and less as time goes on. But I would compare it to the intense emotional attachment many Christians have to the Virgin Mary. The earth womb bodhisattva is especially associated with parents mourning their deceased children when there's been a miscarriage or when a child has died younger than the parents. There are doubtless many, many people who have strong emotional connections to this tradition still today, even if they would never believe in supernatural effects of the statue. However, culture is not static. Culture doesn't exist as a statue in a museum. That's dead culture. Culture only exists and persists when people actively reproduce it, when people are making it new again and again. And during World War II, the Japanese believed in this enough to try to reproduce this culture in Taiwan. That's a really interesting test of faith. And today, there are Japanese who are trying to export various forms of Buddhist philosophy abroad. And you can take a glance at what those are. But I don't think anyone is trying to sell this magical statue that's linked to mourning dead infants and so on. So there's a shift. Many of the aspects of Buddhism that have been promoted ferociously in the last few decades have no authentic basis in the ancient text. It's been tremendous success for so-called breathing meditation. I can give you a link to an article I've written discussing what the ancient text actually says. Breathing meditation is a fraud, and it's a money-making fraud. People pay money to learn so-called breathing meditation from Buddhist gurus, some of them monks, some of them lay people. It's not an ancient or authentic part of Buddhism, and the modern history, you can read the article. So-called interdependence is not an ancient and authentic part of the Buddhist philosophy, and it can't be reconciled coherently with what the text says on one subject or on any other subject. If you just read the first couple of paragraphs of the article I can link you to, the article I've written about it, you'll see that the timeline of who said what is just basically those three authors. Most recent are in 1975. And then this idea spread all over the world. Hundreds of university professors and thousands of monks now preach this story that is not supported by a single sentence in the Pali Canon. No more than the concept of the virgin birth of Jesus is supported by a single sentence in the Bible. It is an intentional mistranslation, actively promoted, actively deceiving people. At least as much as the story of the virgin birth of Jesus. I should clarify for the 100th time that what is most ancient and most authentic is not necessarily the most rational or the most appealing to modern people today. Indra, the ancient god Indra, is an important part of ancient Buddhism. He's not an important part of modern Buddhism. Look around, try to find a statue of Indra. Once in a long while you can find an image or a painting of him in any temple, whether it's in Thailand or China or what have you. Indra has dropped out of the faith. And when you know what's really ancient and what's not, you're always running into funny coincidences of fragments that have remained intact from the ancient period through to today. Throughout China, at least until recently, they still had the belief in what was called the kitchen god in English, that once every 2 weeks on the lunar calendar cycle, there was a magical messenger of the gods who came to check on who's naughty and who's nice. And part of the Chinese tradition was actually leaving out a bribe, leaving out some food once every 2 weeks in the kitchen, so that when the messenger of the gods came to visit, he would be less likely to report back to the gods on the sins and evil things he's been committing. If you talk to Chinese people today, they think this is folk tradition that comes from China. It's in the Pali Canon. It's part of the most ancient tradition extant in Buddhism that survived as a folk practice in China today. And to give one more example that I think would and could influence thousands of people, Richard Gombrich, an academic but a proponent of Buddhism, lifelong proponent, and very influential in the last 50 years. He put out a series of theses on the epistemology and ontology of Buddhism. These are not trivial matters. If you have a standard Western education of philosophy, those are normally the first two things you look for. You look for ontology, epistemology, ethics. And actually, Gombrich covers all three in his thesis. His thesis is a lie. Every piece of evidence used to support it is based on fraud. And I have an article on the internet that shows you that fact, exposes it fairly rapidly. It takes some work to go through. But what Gombrich has done, even though he's supposedly a secular Western thinker, it's not incompetence. You look at any of the examples where I have Gombrich's claim about philosophy, the source that he quotes, and then my explanation of what that quote really means in its original context, looking at the original language. It's not accidental. And he's not capable of that kind of incompetence. These are brand new ancient lies. And the reason why they're powerful, well, the reasons are everything I discussed in the first two parts, bundled up with this big fundamental problem, crisis of modernity, of looking back, reconsidering, reevaluating. What is a definitive ancient part of Buddhism? The belief that a Buddhist monk who has attained nirvana can fly through the air like Superman, among other superpowers. That is an authentic, ancient, definitive part of Buddhism. On the one hand, nobody is sincerely interested in preaching a form of Buddhism that believes in and valorizes this belief that Buddhist monks today can fly, or that they should be able to fly, or that they're doing something wrong if they've been meditating for all these years and can't fly. On the other hand, nobody wants to teach a version of Buddhism that said, well, 2,000 years ago there were monks who could fly, but today people have lost the art and nobody is meditating, nobody's attaining nirvana correctly, so nobody can fly. Nobody wants to teach a version of Buddhism that is authentic but is a crumpled failure of its former self. But the third possibility for me is also not viable. I do not think the future of this religion can be a lie in which people pretend that those texts don't exist, that Buddhism never was built on this type of supernatural claim, that meditation, jhana, and nirvana, that they didn't involve supernatural powers, monks flying, monks radiating fire out of their bodies and walking through walls and so on. That has been, in the 20th century, a major attempt to solve the crisis of modernity in Buddhism. But again, I would say that that doesn't solve the problems. It only distracts people from them. And if you're going to draw people into the religion on a false premise, on the promise of a scientific and rational Buddhism, then you are going to lose those people the minute they find out that you're lying to them. And it doesn't take that long for people to get to that minute. Like these days, now that the texts are available in digital format, it could be about 10 minutes. Fraud in Buddhism. It takes money away from people. It sometimes takes medicine away from people, tells people to just meditate and not get medical help. So it sometimes kills people. It sometimes sexually abuses people. But fraud in Buddhism, the main victim is Buddhist philosophy itself. I've met so many people who dedicated years of their lives to Buddhism, and at the end of those years were just as ignorant as they were at the beginning. And they've spent those years worshiping statues, sometimes worshiping living monks, the same monks they give money to, repeating magical formulas, involved in all kinds of superstitious practices, whether they involve statues or mandalas or mountains of colored sand. And they are just as ignorant or worse after years have gone by. So what have they been defrauded out of, apart from the loss of time and money? Sadly, they've been cheated of the opportunity to learn what the Buddhist philosophy is.